when you looked at the water molecules and their conversion from water to gas, you must have noticed that not all water molecules converted at the same pace. Some converted earlier than others, right? The same is true for the world economy. Not all societies move from stagnation to growth at the same pace, and consequently an incredible divergence occurred in the world economy. And what is it based upon? In the case of the water molecules, it's the position of the water molecules in the teapot. In the case of the world economy, it's predominantly geography and how geography affected the evolution of different societies and propelled some societies into sustained economic growth and trapped others in the Malthusian trap for a prolonged period of time. So when you think about the roots of inequality across the globe today, as I said, it is associated with forces that operated in the distant past, not today. So in my book, The Journey of Humanity, I divide, in fact, the structure of the analysis into two parts. In the first part, I try to resolve the mystery of growth. I start with humanity in Africa, I march all the way forward to today's world, and I resolve the mystery of growth. But in the second part, I start in today's world with the inequality as we see today, and I start to step back and ask myself, what are the roots of inequality as we see it today? So naturally, if you think about the causes of uneven development across the globe, many, not so long ago, argued that the roots of inequality across the globe has to do with the fact that some societies have greater human capital formation than others. Namely, some societies are more educated. Some societies invest in machinery or in physical capital more than others. And some societies have more advanced technologies. That's absolutely right, but it doesn't take us anywhere. The question, of course, why some societies fail to invest properly in education and machinery, and why some societies fail to adopt advanced technologies. And this takes us, in fact, into deeper roots of economic development. Namely, it takes us into the question how historical and prehistorical forces were barriers in the process of development. So when we think about historical and prehistorical barriers to development, one can consider what I call deeper roots, colonialism, institutions and cultural characteristics, and what I will define as the ultimate roots, namely geographical conditions and population diversity. So let's start to march backward, and let's consider the role of colonialism and why colonialism is in fact so important. So colonialism naturally is associated with extraction and asymmetric trade. So colonies specialize in the production of agricultural goods and raw materials. And these goods had limited technological externalities and limited demand for human capital. And consequently, in the context of the wheels of change, in these societies, specialization depressed demand for human capital, delayed the demographic transition, and as a result, we delayed the transition from stagnation to growth. If you think about the wheels of change that I mentioned, this was a stick in the wheels rather than oil that can lubricate the movements of these wheels. But if you think about the colonizers, think about England at the time, having trade with less developed societies permitted them to specialize in the production of industrial goods, goods that are human capital intensive, that have great technological externalities, and as a result of it, this fostered human capital formation, fostered the timing of the demographic transition, and expedited the takeoff from stagnation to growth. But when we think about the wheels of change, colonialism operated differentially in the context of less developed societies and advanced societies. In some societies, it expedited the rotations of the wheels of change. In others, it slowed it down, generated some of the inequality that we see. But importantly, when you think about colonialism, colonialism is already predicated on uneven development. The identity of the colonizers and the identities of the colonies are based on the fact that there is uneven development in the world in the eve of colonialization. And this causes us to think about deeper roots, namely what permitted some societies to colonize others. So next, I'm focusing on the fingerprints of institutions, namely the emergence of differential institutions across the globe, growth-enhancing, inclusive institutions in some regions of the world, and growth-retarding, extractive institutions in other regions of the world. And many argue that this perhaps can explain a significant portion of the variations across the globe. But when we think about institutions, we have to remember that institutions typically are not manna from heaven. They did not emerge randomly in the course of human history. So there are some critical junctures in which institutions, good institutions are imposed in one part of the world and bad institutions are imposed in others, and this is a source of development. But to a large extent, this is the exception rather than the rule. So let's talk first about this random critical juncture. So typically, if you think about the Black Death and the decimation of the European population over this time period, the Black Death is associated typically with the decline of feudalism in England. Why? Because there was great scarcity of labor in the urban sector. This generated a competition over labor between the urban sector and the rural sector, and consequently made concessions by the landed aristocracy and brought about the decline of feudalism and ultimately perhaps early industrialization in England. So this is one critical juncture that is important. A second one is the Glorious Revolution. As you know, the Glorious Revolution in England in the end of the 17th century is leading into the constitutional monarchy in England and ultimately into the development of property rights that perhaps are leading into early industrialization. So this is again a very important critical juncture, and one can think about a counterfactual history in which James II would have defeated Williams of Orange in the course of the Glorious Revolution, and in fact absolute monarchy would have remained in England, and England would not experience industrialization early. And perhaps the most striking critical juncture is the division of Korea along the 38th parallel. So naturally, quite capriciously, Korea is being divided along the 38th parallel between a northern part that is sphere of influence of communism and a southern part that is sphere of influence of the West. And after a 70-year period, the South enjoy income per capita that is 24-fold larger than the North. So naturally there, I cannot invoke different ethnicities or different geography. It is the same geographical region, the same ethnic group that is divided capriciously, and ultimately institutions explain nearly 100% of the variations in income per capita. So this is wonderful, but in fact, you can count these examples on a single hand. What we see, mostly, is that institutions evolve gradually in the course of human history. And consequently, institutions are a byproduct largely of earlier geographical conditions. So think first about the Neolithic Revolution, the transition to agriculture. The transition to agriculture is associated with an enormous increase in population density. It is associated with the emergence of cities, states, empires, and as a result of it, it generates demand for institutions that can coordinate the actions of individuals and permit the implementation of public goods. So institutions is a byproduct of the process of development, not the trigger of the process of development in a critical juncture in human history. But what about the nature of institutions, inclusive versus extractive? So if you think about Europe, Europe is characterized by land fragmentation. China, in contrast, is characterized by geographical connectivity. And this led into political competition in Europe and inclusive institutions that ultimately emerge in this region, whereas in China, it led into political uniformity and extractive institutions. So again, we can map the nature of institutions across the globe to earlier geographical conditions. And the final example is the suitability of land for large plantations. Suitability of land for large plantations, as is present, say, in Central America, led into the concentration of land ownership, concentration of political power, and ultimately into the emergence of oppressive labor market institutions, including slavery. Namely, again, it is the geography that brought about institutions that ultimately generated some of the uneven development that we see across the globe. The institutions are important, and if you look at the partial R-square of institutions, they explain 2 to 9% of the variations in inequality across the globe. But they are far from being the dominating force that we see across the globe. So this brings us into the cultural factor. Informal institutions, if you wish. And what we see is that over time, there is a certain adherence to cultural norms that is essential for survival. And why is it so? Because norms reflected the cumulative knowledge or the cumulative wisdom of society, and consequently, it permitted individuals to act as if they understand their surrounding based on this cumulative knowledge. So deviations from cultural norms over most of human history was not very beneficial.